Let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Let me welcome you on behalf of Christian Osterman, who is the director of the Global Europe program, and of course on behalf of Jane Harmon, who is our new president and CEO. I'm Kent Hughes. I'm currently a public policy scholar here at the center. And for those of you who are new to the center, let me give you a bit of a background. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, was the only president to have had a PhD. In his era, he was quite a prominent political scientist with 8 or 9 books to his credit, at least one of which is still used in classrooms today. He went on to become president of Princeton, and then the bosses in New Jersey thought he'd be easy to control. They lured him into a race for the governorship and got an education about how difficult he was to control. He went on, as you know, to be a 2-term president and quite a consequential president. When the Congress wanted to honor him, they decided against another monument on the Mall or another marble statue, and instead created this living memorial, the Woodrow Wilson Center. And here they ask us to bring together both sides of his life. That side which was researching and thinking about public policy, together with people who are making and influencing public policy here in Washington, around the country, and increasingly around the world. Research is certainly a big part of our mission. We will have over the course of a year 150 people or so who will spend some time here doing research focused on some aspect of public policy. Many are academics, but not all. We will have, for instance, members of Congress who, after they have finished their service, come here to reflect on what they've done, perhaps write some articles about advice for the future. We've had people from administrations, a number of journalists have come here and actually have produced a number of very popular, insightful books. I also should mention that I'm part of the Global Europe program as well, and that the Global Europe program builds on, in fact, Sam Wells, who's here for many years, ran the European program as well as the International Studies program. And this really builds on that prior work. And we're looking in the Global Europe sense not only at Europe itself, everything from security, the future of NATO, where's the Euro going, what about the broader EU community, but also Europe's continuing central role on the global stage. How are they approaching the challenge of the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria puts it? Certainly we in the U.S. can learn some lessons about a very experienced Europe can teach us. And before I actually introduce today's topic and this very distinguished set of panelists, I jotted some notes on a news flash that I just saw on my computer before coming in here. That I'm not surprised at this announcement. I'd speculated about it. But there has been the announcement of the formation of a pan-Celtic union that includes not only Scotland, but Ireland, Wales, the Isle of Man, Brittany, and so forth. And actually, Galicia is now a candidate member as well. And they were sensitive. They've both looked seriously at some of the economic implications here, but also done it with a bit of humor. They realize that they're going to have to think about the currency question. It's been quite an issue of debate in Scotland. And so, recognizing that they're not quite the size of England itself, they have put out a white paper discussing the formation of the Celtic ounce, which they would use as a future currency. So I think this is a development. This is April 1st, as everyone knows. Yes. Well, even more seriously, we've got a very interesting topic to discuss. And when someone anywhere talks about independence, it has an immediate resonance here in the United States. July 4th, everyone here and Americans around the world are celebrating Independence Day. So there is a resonance when Scotland talks about independence. So many Americans and actually so many presidents have been of Scottish descent that there's a kind of affinity and very great deal of interest. Well, this debate has taken on a added intensity in Scotland and in England and in the United Kingdom. And although it's quite civic by American standards, there has been a growing contention over this question of would an independent Scotland be able to use the pound or not. The United Kingdom had been adamant that the pound would be out. Now the Guardian last Friday, I believe it was, published an article saying that some senior minister in the cabinet had said that, well, of course we'd work it out, they could use the pound. And this triggered quite a reaction in Scotland, and it paralleled the accusation by Mr. Alex Salmond, the First Minister, that the British are being guilty of bluster, and bullying. So maybe we'll see a little more American-style campaigning before this is over. Well, let me introduce this really outstanding panel. To your right and my immediate left, we're delighted to welcome James Mitchell here to the center. He holds the chair in public policy at the University of Edinburgh. He's had previous chairs at a number of other universities, including Sheffield and Strathclyde. He is focused on a variety of questions, but certainly on this question of Scottish independence, and has a forthcoming book called The Scottish Question, which is probably going to get a great deal of question there, and I would guess in much of Europe. He has a PhD from Nuffield College, Oxford University. I'm also delighted to welcome Daniel Keneally, who's further to my left and a bit further to your right. He is a lecturer and associate director at the University of Edinburgh's Academy of Government. He is currently advising the Scottish Parliament and the sort of on the EU aspects or the implications of an independence referendum. He is very interested in UK-EU relations. Of course, there may be, in fact, a referendum on staying or not staying in the EU. And he's continuing to look at other EU-related topics such as the Eurozone and closer EU integration. He has a PhD, an MSc, and in EU law and politics, and an MA in, international relations, all from the University of Edinburgh. To my further right is Alexander Munz. Welcome back to the center, Alex. It's a pleasure to see you. He is a multi-talented scholar who's currently an adjunct professor at the EAE Business School in Spain, and he's had appointments at a number of other leading European universities and other institutions. At one point, he was head of the Europe program at the DICOB Foundation, a leading think tank in Spain. If you're in Europe, you will find him appearing frequently in print, on TV. He's the author of 5 books. His most recent one is Ethical Capitalism. That's greeted with some sense of an oxymoron here in the United States, What It Can Do for You. And finally, but certainly not last, we're delighted to welcome Michael Geary back to the center. Michael has been a global fellow with us in the past, was here in residence for a year where he finished his second book on European integration and the Session 2 European membership. He is now a global fellow associated with the Global Europe program. He is a graduate of the National University of Ireland and holds a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. We've asked the speakers to talk for 10 minutes or so to give us a sense of how they see the Scottish referendum, a yes or a no, its implications, whether it goes one way or another, the broader implications certainly for Europe, where there are other sub-national units that feel they might want to walk down the path of independence. And of course, we remember that a very famous American president once called for self-determination, something that still resonates in Europe and in many parts of the world. James, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I'm having to suck a vocal zone to get through this. I'm not being rude, but it's the only way I can get through this. My throat's really causing me some difficulties this morning. What I want to try and do is offer a broad overview of the debate and the debate on the ground in Scotland. Look at the nature of the campaign and some of the key issues. I won't be going into any great detail, but hopefully some of that can emerge in the discussion afterwards. Interesting the idea of this pan-Celtic union. I was in Newcastle in the north of England at the end of last week and discussing these very issues, where of course there is a great deal of interest because just over the border from Scotland there's bound to be interest in the implications for that part of the world. And it was very interesting that one of the questions that arose from the floor was, if you vote yes, can we join you? So it's more than pan-Celtic. It seems as if we could extend that much further. What I want to talk about is the Scottish question. It's the title of my forthcoming book. And I prefer to call it the Scottish question rather than the independence question, because I think we need to set the current referendum into a broader context. And I want to explore what I mean by the Scottish question in a moment. Scottish question is deliberately vague and open, because I think the debate is very open in the nature of the debate. And I would argue that there are really 4 key components to this debate, which has been going on for a long number of years. This referendum is merely the latest iteration in a long-standing debate, indeed a debate that goes back to 1707. And frankly, let me give you my conclusion now, and that is that the referendum result on the 18th of September will not resolve the Scottish question, whether we vote yes or vote no. There will continue to be a Scottish question or questions that will not be resolved. It will be potentially a very important decision. Some may say it's an historic referendum. Well, we'll wait and see, but one thing is for sure, it will not be conclusive. What do I mean then by the Scottish question? What are the 4 interrelated questions? One is about identity. There's no doubt the identity issue is there in the background. If there wasn't a sense of Scottishness in some shape or form, there wouldn't be a Scottish question. We wouldn't be having this referendum. However, this can be overstated. This is not simply about Scottishness. There's no doubt whatsoever that other factors have given rise to this referendum. Indeed, it's quite interesting when one looks at people's identities in Scotland, is that it's quite clear that it is possible to have a British identity and to support independence, and most certainly it's possible to be very strongly Scottish and oppose independence. Interestingly enough, in the 2011 Scottish elections, some work I and other colleagues did on that election found that amongst those people who saw themselves as British and not Scottish, the Scottish National Party supporting independence outpolled the Conservative Party amongst those who saw themselves as British, which is an interesting aspect of all of this. So identity is important, but it's an insufficient explanation of this question. Second element, obviously, is a constitutional question. What is Scotland's relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom, our UK, and indeed other parts of Europe? This has been an ongoing debate. How does this entity, which exists within the UK, and has always been acknowledged to exist within the UK, UK has never ever, UK central government has never ever tried to impose a uniform identity across Britain. There's never been an attempt to get rid of Scottish institutions, Scottish identity. But that does create all sorts of difficulties and issues. How do you place Scotland within the UK? Clearly, we now have a parliament in Edinburgh, devolution as we call it. It's a parliament within a United Kingdom. And this debate is about whether it should have more powers and indeed independence. So constitutional status is another element to this Scottish question. Another element, and a very important element, is party politics. Scotland is a different party system from that south of the border, and there's no doubt that that's a crucial dynamic. The fact that there is very little support for the Conservative Party in Scotland is hugely important. I would go so far as to argue that the Scottish Parliament, which Scots voted for, the devolved Parliament, back in 1997, was really because of one person, that was Mrs Thatcher. There's a great statue to the first Labour First Minister of Scotland, Donald Dewar, in Glasgow. I've always argued that actually the wrong person is on that statue. There really ought to be a statue to Margaret Thatcher, because the Scots really very much united in favour of Parliament because they wanted to create a buffer to stop Thatcherism at the border, to use some of the rhetoric from that time. So party politics and the perception of a different party system in Scotland has been hugely important and is important today in the debates. The fact that only one of 59 Scottish MPs is a Tory MP is part of it. That doesn't mean to say, I should stress, that on issues there is a massive difference between the Scots and the rest of the United Kingdom. The Scots are very capital C Conservative, but are actually very small c Conservative. We don't like the Tories, but we're actually quite conservative. And therein lies an interesting tale which others may want to pick up on and we may want to debate. So that's been an important part of it. And the fourth related element is, in fact, of course, something that I've already mentioned, and that is everyday public policy. There is a perception in Scotland that we would pursue different types of policies, that we do have different agendas from that south of the border. The perception is that Scotland is more social democratic, or even some would say more radical and socialist. I would certainly question that, than our UK. And there is some evidence on this, but it is usually exaggerated, frankly. But nonetheless, the perception is that Scotland is different. I used to argue in the 1980s that one of the great problems for the Conservatives is that if the Tory government under Mrs Thatcher put £100 in every Scot's back pocket, the Scots would still resist it and think there was something wrong. They were still trying to do something to do us down. In fact, that's actually what was happening, because the Conservatives were actually quite generous, as indeed all UK governments have been to Scotland. So it's not just about money in that sense. It is about legitimacy, a sense that this is an alien government, a government with very little support in Scotland, I think is hugely important. But the four elements, identity, constitutional status, party politics, and everyday public policy, together create what I call the Scottish question. And of course now we have this referendum on independence. So what's happening in this independence referendum? Well, if you're watching this referendum from here, I guess you're watching it in the media, you're looking at the press, the Scotsman Herald newspapers and such like, and you will get a particular take on this referendum. I have to say it is a very, very particular take, and I would like to suggest there's a lot more going on underneath the surface. So what is actually happening? Well, on the one hand, I think we've got a debate which is a classic campaign set of issues have arisen. Very adversarial. One side making one claim, the other side making a counter-claim. It is very difficult, I think, for the electorate to really know what's likely to happen if they simply pay attention to the two campaign groups, Yes, Scotland and Better Together. Nothing new in that. Nothing new in that. That's the nature of democratic politics. The really interesting question will be what happens on the other side of a yes or no vote. If there's a yes vote, much that has been said by each side will be watered down. We will move from a kind of campaigning mindset into a governing mindset. Governing mindsets require compromises and such like. And it's very interesting. The Guardian report last week that you referred to, there's a UK minister who said something that wasn't supposed to be said, I suspect, until after the referendum was over. But actually it's very welcome, I think, for those of us who want to get a real sense of what's going on. But each side, inevitably, in this debate will be doing this. So where are we and what kind of issues are arising? Well, again, I think one of the interesting things is that there are issues which are of great interest to the elites. European Union membership is being debated endlessly, heatedly. Would Scotland be allowed automatic membership of the EU? Would it be kicked out and have to negotiate its way in? This has been a debate that I remember following, first of all, way back in the late 80s, and I was saying earlier that I haven't heard anything particularly new in the last couple of years on this. It's a very important issue. The extent to which the public at large are engaged with this is doubtful, frankly. We just don't know exactly what the public are thinking. But it's unlikely to be the case that they're going to be that concerned about treaties and about Article this and that and whether Scotland would get in. A lot of this will come down to whether the electorate trusts one side more than the other. It is going to come down to issues of trust and also, crucially, issues of risk. To what extent are Scots willing to take the risk, as the no side are emphasising, of this great step into the unknown, or as the yes side are insisting, this is actually not such a scary move after all. Very interesting, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, the Yes campaign's rhetoric would have us believe that actually a vote for yes will involve a great deal of continuity, and we're getting a great deal of emphasis in their rhetoric on the continuation of the monarchical union. We'd still have the Queen as head of state and so on and so forth, and we'd still have the single currency and so on and so forth. One of the great challenges for the yes side, I suspect, is that if it's all going to be the same, well, what's the point? And that's going to be something I think they have to be aware of. Another interesting feature of this campaign is, I think, the different strengths of the two sides. The yes side have enormous advantage, I think, on the ground. They have many more activists on the ground. We think that's the case, and I have to say we think rather than we know this, because we don't really have a great deal of systematic scientific evidence on this, but certainly that is the impression one gets as one travels across Scotland, and certainly from what we know about the party membership. The SNP's membership now probably comfortably exceeds the membership of all the other political parties in Scotland combined. And more importantly, the SNP membership has always been very active as compared with other parties. So they've got the activists on the ground. However, the no side has another set of advantages. The no side has the media, the press, overwhelmingly on side. And of course, when it comes down to the resources that can be brought to bear in a campaign between a UK government and UK Parliament versus the Scottish government and the Parliament it controls, then really the no side has a massive advantage. So there's a very interesting issue here for us as students of political behaviour in terms of what may emerge in terms of the kind of ground war versus air war. Some of the issues are arising are around the currency, obviously, around the economy, but ultimately I think probably summed up fairly simply as to whether Scots feel they would be better off and whether they feel they would have control over their own affairs, the extent to which they're willing to take this risk. And this leads me to think that actually this is not quite as simple as some would suggest, and that actually I'm not convinced that the Scots will vote for it, because ultimately, I'm now going to go on record as something I've tried to avoid doing, because ultimately I think that the Scots are really rather small c conservative. However, in the event of a decent yes vote, and we can come back to discussing what a decent yes vote would involve, I suspect that this issue will simply carry on at an elite level, at a mass level, at an intensity that we've come to expect over the last few years. In other words, the Scottish question will not disappear at all, even in the short term. Let me conclude by actually quoting from a great work of English history and suggest that the Scottish question is rather like the Irish question. Yeatman and Sellers in their 1066 and all that made the observation, that witty book, that Gladstone spent his declining years trying to guess the answer to the Irish question. Unfortunately, whenever he was getting warm, the Irish secretly changed the question. My suspicion is because the Scottish question consists of these 4 different elements. These elements will continue to exist in some shape or form, some mixture well into the future, that this referendum cannot and will not resolve it, even if there's a yes vote, because Scots will continue to have to redefine, renegotiate their relationships with the rest of the UK, and indeed in terms of their identity, public policies and party systems. So for me, this referendum is an interesting episode in a long history, but it is unlikely to resolve very much.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Thank you. Good morning. I will confine my comments to the European Union dimension of this particular debate, and I think a lot of it will chime, complement what James has said. The issue of European Union membership for independent Scotland, it is a very controversial issue. It's intermittently animated this debate from the start, and indeed the debate has been going on since, as James said, since the 1980s at least, in terms of what this process would be. There's been a number of interventions from the European Commission President over the last year or so from Barroso. There's been an inquiry into whether the Scottish First Minister breached the ministerial code on this issue of legal advice about European Union membership. The conclusion was, I should say that on the record, that he didn't. I should say that clearly. There was a misstep just a few weeks ago by the BBC journalist Andrew Marr, where he seemed to offer his own opinion during an interview with Alex Salmond. Alex Salmond rubbing his hands together with glee after that. So this issue of European Union membership does seem to come back again and again. It's controversial and it's persistent. But what is the real issue? Well, the real issue is what would happen. What would happen to Scotland's membership of the European Union should it vote for independence? And in the brief time that I've got this morning, I just kind of want to make a few points, maybe 4 points, and then perhaps explore them more in discussion if we have time. At the moment, I would just point out that the Scottish Parliament's European and External Relations Committee is conducting an inquiry on this topic. And the evidence that's been collected by that committee so far, which is all available online, I think is a really fantastic resource. There have been some very prominent lawyers, political scientists, and practitioners who've given evidence to that committee, and I think it's given the most, together that evidence represents the most comprehensive discussion of this topic, I think, to date. The first point that I'd make is kind of the political point. How does this issue fit into the politics of the campaign, which James was discussing? And to me, it seems quite simple. Is it simply become grist to the mill of the two campaign meta-narratives, if you want? James summed them up very well, I think, which is on the pro-independence side, it's this concept of stability, it's this concept of embeddedness. If you vote yes, then an independent Scotland will be embedded in a whole range of institutional arrangements that you're familiar with, and therefore there's a degree of continuity and stability there, and the European Union is just one of them. The pound would be another, the monarchy would be another, and so on, shared intelligence arrangements, etc., etc. For the pro-union campaign, it's an element of risk, it's an element of uncertainty. Their meta-narrative is, well, if you vote yes, you really don't know what you're going to get here, and you don't know what the issue will be, you don't know what your membership status of Europe will be, you won't get the pound, so on and so forth. So this just slots in like any other issue, in a sense, to these two campaign meta-narratives. The problem with that, from a sort of scholarly perspective, if you want to try and reason through this, is it becomes a very sterile discussion. You just get a clash of assertions, which has been something which has struck me about the debate. I think a lot of the content of the debate in Scotland at the moment is actually quite good, but the headlines can often descend into one side saying, you won't get this, and then the other side saying, oh, come on, of course we will, when we actually... I mean, and it goes no further. That was the discussion about the pound. I mean, effectively, when George Osborne made his speech about the pound a few weeks ago, that was him saying, no, you won't get to use the pound, and the Scottish Government's response was to say little more than, we will, of course we will. And I don't think that's particularly conducive to reasoned political debate. It gets a little sterile. So that's the sort of the political context of this Europe question. The second point that I'd make is more on the substance of what would happen. And the short answer, or at least the place to start, I guess, is we really don't know what would happen. There's no precedent for this. This is something that everybody agrees on. There's nothing in the European Union treaties that speaks to this issue. There's no precedent in European case law. And there's no really appropriate historical precedent. People talk about Greenland, people talk about German unification, but they're not, I don't think they're particularly good historical precedents. Despite this lack of precedent and this lack of a definitive answer, though, the Commission, particularly in the guise of its president, have been quite keen to wade into this debate. And the official position, I suppose, probably quite widely known now, is from the Commission, if part of a member state decides to leave an existing member state of the European Union, then it also exits the European Union and must apply for membership through the normal accession process, Article 49 of the treaty, and so on and so forth. Now, the Commission have been keen to stress that when they've made these statements, or Barroso has been keen to stress, he's only commenting on a general situation. He's not commenting on the specifics of the Scottish situation. Now, I would suggest that these interventions are not particularly helpful. First of all, well, I guess the main reason why I'd say that they're not helpful is there's no dialogue on the back of it. It's simply a statement. It's a letter, in this case, a letter that Barroso wrote to the House of Lords saying, this is our reading of the treaty, and then there's no opportunity to engage in dialogue. And to me, the immediate question that has to be asked of the official position is, well, what happens at the moment of Scottish independence? Let's hypothesize that we have a vote in September and Scotland votes yes. We then have an 18-month period between that vote and independence in March 2016. Do we literally just walk day by day up to the moment at which Scotland leaves at midnight on the, whatever it is, the 16th of March or whatever the date is? Scotland will exit the European Union at that minute. And if so, what are the implications of that? Now, this is not something which the Commission have been prepared to engage in. They simply make their statement and then they close down the discussion, which is why I don't think it's very helpful. Because to me, it invites chaos. The official position invites a degree of chaos in the sense that it would trigger a very sudden and sharp dislocation of the European single market. And when we think about the essence of that market and the reciprocal rights and obligations involved in that market and the interdependencies that it creates, to me, this doesn't seem like a very tenable official position to hold. And given that the Commission is actually charged with maintaining the integrity of the single market. You could even go so far as to say it's almost in dereliction of duty in taking this position, because it is to invite the chaos of a dislocation to that market, which would not just have implications for the millions of European Union citizens living in Scotland, it would also have implications for European Union citizens from all of the member states in Scotland, living, working, studying, trading, so on and so forth. So I think there's an issue with the official position on pragmatic grounds. There's also a normative issue. This is an institution, the European Union, which claims to stand for the values of democracy, self-determination, and proclaims to work on the principles of sincere cooperation and good faith. And to me, the official position seems to fly in the face of those normative considerations. It effectively leads to the expulsion of citizens from a union, a democratic union, simply because they exercise a democratic right to self-determination. I think the normative issue is secondary. That's probably more of an academic discussion. But the pragmatic issue of creating a hole in the single market, I think, is something that needs to be thought through much more carefully. The third point that I'd make is that however the issue is resolved, whether it is a formal accession process through Article 49 or what the Scottish Government are proposing, which is that you could amend the treaties through Article 48. And I don't want to dwell too much on that technical issue because this is my third point. However the issue is resolved, whichever route, everybody is going to have to agree. All of the European Union member states, all 28, will have to agree on this process. There's unanimity required either through Article 49 or through Article 48. Now, this has raised the spectre of a Spanish veto, potentially. There's been a lot of discussion in the Scottish media, and I suspect media elsewhere, about, well, will Spain veto membership, Scottish membership, and so on. Perhaps that's something we could return to in a discussion, although I just note the official position at the moment is that the Spanish government have said, at least I think the most recent statement, was that they see the Article 49 process as the most appropriate, but there's been no mention of a veto, at least to date. So I think given the complexities of the debate and given the need to avoid the hole in the single market, to me the question is, how do you get the ball rolling on this after a yes vote? How do you put some sort of system in place that would allow the issue to be resolved in that 18-month period? And that brings me to my fourth point, which is about the timescale for this. Because we're looking at an 18-month window. And the question of what happens if there's a yes vote, the complexities of the negotiations that would have to take place between the UK and Scotland, on the one hand, between the UK and the European Union, and also between Scotland and the European Union. There's going to be an incredibly complex sort of trilateral set of negotiations going on in parallel. And to me, 18 months is an incredibly short amount of time to resolve these issues. I think the quickest accession to the European Union to date was 13 months to actually handle the accession negotiations, and then a further 10 months to ratify them. And that was the 1995 enlargement. So there's an issue, I think, potentially about 18 months, and then the question of, well, what happens if we get to Independence Day and the issue hasn't been resolved? Do we have bridging arrangements? Do we have some sort of associate membership status? Or do we simply just move Scotland outside of the European Union for a period? To me, as I say, that would be deeply problematic as someone who's studying this academically. So I think the negotiations would be very complicated, and they'd hinge around this issue of opt-outs. And the opt-outs are, again, something which is become a key part of the debate in Scotland, because it links back to the currency question. Would Scotland enjoy an opt-out on the euro, for instance, or would it be compelled somehow to adopt the euro? It links to issues of free movement. The UK currently, obviously, is not part of the Schengen zone. It has a common travel area with Ireland, and so there's an issue about how whether we'd have to have a border after independence with the UK. So the Europe issue sort of percolates out into these other issues of currency and mobility within the British Isles as such too. So there's a lot of complex negotiation that would have to be taken care of during those 18 months. Now, just to sort of conclude and to try and bring this back round to the politics, despite all of that, despite all of the complexity and the fascination that some people have with it, as James said, this is not a particularly salient issue in the debate. The elites are very engaged in it. The Parliament's having an inquiry on it. But the evidence from the public attitudes, public opinion surveys is that this is not a particularly resonant issue. Less than 3% of respondents in a poll earlier this year ranked it as one of the top five, I think, the top five concerns that they have around the independence referendum. It's not an issue that splits yes and no voters. Yes and no voters have attitudes towards the European Union that are broadly similar. And the other point that I'd note, just slightly more broadly about Scotland and the European Union, is that Euroscepticism, not of the UKIP variety, as we have down in England, the UK Independence Party, but Euroscepticism more broadly is actually on the rise in Scotland. If we look in the past 10 years, from 2003 to 2013, in the social attitude survey, there's been a 20% rise in the number of people responding that either we should leave or that the EU's powers should be reduced. And that's a 20% swing in 10 years, which is really, to me, is a very significant shift. It's not the same type of vehement Euroscepticism as we get in parts of the English electorate, but it is nevertheless, I think, an interesting trend. But so far, the evidence seems to be that the Europe debate, the Europe issue, is being kind of tuned out as background noise because, as I say, to come back to my first point, we're getting just clashes of narratives here. Yes, you'll be in pretty much automatically. No, we won't, and so on and so forth. And so the voters are sort of recognizing that they won't actually get a firm answer to this. There's too much uncertainty. And then the issue returns, as James said, to one of trust. Which side in this debate do they trust to handle the issue more competently? Which side do they trust them to be telling them a more truthful depiction of the likely possibility? I think, you know, if there is a yes vote, I think there would be tremendous pressure, pragmatic pressure, to deal with the situation. I make no prediction about how the situation would be resolved, what treatment Scotland would get in the negotiations. I wouldn't want to speculate on that too much. But I do think that the pragmatic pressure of avoiding that hole in the single market would concentrate minds. And a lot of the bluster that's going on at the moment would be replaced by a degree of common sense and a degree of pragmatism. But short of that, I wouldn't want to make any firmer predictions.
Alex?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Christian, who, of course, is doing an event on Turkey, and Kent and the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me. And I've been told that, you know, in Washington it's best to not speak too much. So, but given that I'm both Spanish and Catalan, I hope that Kent will give me some latitude on this issue. And thank
As you bring up Wales, that'll be okay.
Sure. And I also want to thank Emily and Christina for the hard work that they've put in to arrange this event. I'm not sure exactly if you're able to, if you have some of the material that I provided, which has more to do with the economics and the financing of how Catalonia what would happen to Catalonia and to Spain in the event of Catalonia seceding from Spain, which is a material that hopefully has been distributed. Now, about this topic, when I have to kind of insert some biographical things, so to kind of, as a disclaimer for what I'm going to say later. When I kind of put on my U.S. Part of my crazy transatlantic life for 12 years, when I kind of put that on hold after serving great honor serving as a speechwriter to the President of the World Bank and in a similar capacity to the President of the Inter-American Development Bank. And when I put that on hold and went back to Europe in the summer of 2011, I did a study and part of the difficulty for me is that I personally know leaders on both sides, Spanish government and the Catalan government. And I did a consultancy for the Catalan government, for one of the think tanks of the party that is in power, about Eurozone issues and global governance of the Eurozone, you know, Euro bonds and ECB, whether it should buy bonds in the secondary market, and the right mix between stability and the right mix between austerity and growth and so forth. And then I found out, my goodness, after 2 years in Washington, now we got the Northern European countries and the Southern European countries. They're not happy. They're pitted against one another. And then I say, okay, well, I'll focus more on Spanish issues, Spanish, you know, internal economic Spanish issues. And I go, okay. And I was so happy because I have to say on the record, I have worked for socialist politicians, socialist in Europe. I've worked for a former deputy prime minister of Spain who was socialist. And I always try to assess politicians on what they do. Obviously, I have my views, and depending whether it's economics, defense, but I always try to really assess politicians and what they do. And so I was happy. I'm going back to Spain now, and my guys are in power. The center-right Partido Popular in Spain and Convergencia Unió in Catalonia, because both governments inherited a terrible mess, which is one that later in the Q&A I can get into more. And then now my guys in Madrid and Barcelona are fighting one another. And that is, I must say, to me, really, it is, and I'm happy to see that, speaking to James and on the Scottish side, that things are more gentlemanly, because things in Spain and Catalonia are not gentlemanly. I've always tried to do something in life, which is what I had the great honor of interviewing James Baker for my PhD on German unification. And Baker's kind of biography is work hard, study, and stay out of politics. And I've tried to do that. But in Catalonia and in Spain, you can't do that right now. I mean, if I go on the media, or they ask me to talk about European integration issues, I have to position myself. And I've tried to avoid that for 2 years. So it is really, to me, it is like the current debate in Catalonia is like being asked to choose, asking somebody to choose between their mother and their father. And also, are you going to live with your mother or with your father? You know, depending on, you know, who are you going to choose, your mother or your father, and who are you going to go live with? So I'm living in Washington, D.C., and I've been away from Spain now for 6 months. And it really, you may laugh, but it really does hurt to me. When I did a presentation on Thursday for some investors in New York, did 100 slides, and I can update you on the numbers on the Spanish economy, and you know, I was trying to tell these investors who are very demanding why they should invest in Spain, and you know, and I also have to always factor in now the Catalan side. As a concept, I'm a believer in unity. I believe that families should be united. I believe that countries should be united. And the former Prime Minister of Spain, socialist, Felipe González, once traveled to China, and he was asked by the Chinese, they made a remark, the Chinese, to Felipe González in the 1980s. They said to him, you guys in Europe, you know, there's such few of you. We're 6% of the world's population. There's such few of you, and you guys are so divided. And of course, from the perspective of China with 1.3 billion people, that is very true, that we are very divided. And so I have to very much say that I think it is a very bad idea that Catalonia would want to secede. I do want to, however, say that, and I again hope some latitude here, both of my grandparents had to emigrate after the Spanish Civil War. And they were both on the Republican side, and both were in favor of, were Catalan nationalists. They both had to emigrate. I also have to say that I have published in Catalan for many years. I've also had the privilege of working for Catalonian politicians and President Mas, whom I consider a friend, and I know that he values me, and I know that, and also a longtime president of Catalonia, Jordi Pujol, who was president for 23 years, and I know them, and they know me, and it's really hard for me. It is very hard for me, because I'm always a grateful person. I have done consultancy for the Catalan government, and I don't want to be somebody who is saying things that are untrue or not accurate, but at the same time, I have my opinions, and if I'm asked, I must express them. Now, I don't know if you're aware that that of course there is the issue of being in Washington. The debate about Catalonian wanting to secede from Spain has not registered as much in Washington as it has in Europe. There is, however, an article in the FT from last Thursday about the latest ruling of the Spanish Constitutional Court on the illegality of the Catalonian Parliament approving a motion in terms of wanting to hold a referendum, a vote on the referendum. And I'm happy in the Q&A to answer questions related to the legality and so forth, and especially the business side. But I want to say that that at a personal level, I attended the first school in Spain where it was allowed to teach Catalan. It was still, and I'm 44, it was still before Franco passed away in 1975. It was the first school that ever got permission during Franco's time, at the end of Franco's dictatorship. And it was a school that very much looked to Europe. And I want to say that right now, unfortunately, President Mas, whom I very much appreciate as a person, is surrounded by people who have basically told him that if Catalonia secedes from Spain, we're going to have, everything will be fine. Everything will be, unemployment's going to go down, and we're going to be very rich, and we'll be rid of the rest of Spain, which is basically taking our money. Now, I feel like my position has never shifted. Catalonia accounts for 20% of Spain's GDP, We're not the richest region. Basque Country, Navarra, as you know, Spain has 17 autonomous regions. The Basque Country, Navarra, the Balearic Islands, these are all autonomous regions. They actually have a higher GDP per capita than Catalonia, but we are 20% of Spain's GDP. And there's no question that we are one of the traditional engines of the Spanish economy. The problem is we're also the region in Spain with the most debt. We have 44 billion euros in debt. And right now, everything is being blamed on Madrid. I hope I'm not ruffling any feathers if I say that here in the United States, there's some people who blame everything on Washington. Everything goes wrong. And Washington may have its dysfunctionality. But some people would want to destroy the Department of Education and the Department of Energy, and I think another department which in a debate was forgotten. So in the same way, that's the debate right now in Catalonia. And there have actually been people who have, I'll tell you, I did a consultancy as part of my 2011 and 2013 stay in Europe, teaching and publicizing my books for the Catalan government. And the consultancy that I suggested was how to better integrate Catalonia in the European Union, working with Madrid. And now we've got the spokesman to the Catalan president saying that it's not a big deal if we leave the European Union and the Eurozone. So I'm just not in shock, because this has been something that has been building up. But I am very, very worried. I'm very saddened when certain people around the president of Catalonia right now, and it's a long story, and maybe in the Q&A if you want to ask me about it, but certain people around the Catalan president have been bombarding the Catalan population with the idea that anything that goes wrong in Catalonia is the fault of Madrid and the rest of Spain. For example, there was some drilling in the southern Catalonia, in Tarragona. That's an area where we have some oil, not very much. We cannot never live off of oil, but a little bit of oil, petrochemical sector. And there was a minor earthquake, a very minor earthquake. And it was blamed on Madrid. I'm not joking. You know, even like bad weather may be blamed on Madrid. So that is something that I think is very, very, the debate we're having right now in Catalonia is not on the issue of the economics and the financing. And I understand the feelings of those involved. Look, my mother and I have decided we're not going to talk about this issue anymore. No, we can't. My mother is 80 years old, and she suffered through the dictatorship. And I understand the feelings of Catalan politicians. Catalonia has 7.5 million people. Of course, Catalonia could be independent, and it would be a viable state in the European, in terms of its per capita income. It's not Austria. It's not on the level of Austria or Finland, as the Catalan politicians like to claim. We're probably GDP per capita proximate to that of Italy. And of course, we could, in a perfect world, we could be independent. We have 7.5 million people, and we have a GDP per capita approximate to that of Italy, not of Austria, Finland. But we are in a currency union. We are in a currency union as opposed to Scotland. And I do not think the European Union is going to make an exception, because then we would have France with Corsica, we would have Italy with Lombardy, and if we take this to an extreme, there are 270 regions in Europe. Now, if we want to be dealing with, the EU is still the biggest economy in the world. The GDP of the EU is still higher than that of the United States. But if we want to be dealing with governance issues, whether security, what's going on in Iran, Syria, what's going on in South Korea, not South Korea, but North Korea's crazy dictator. If we want to be engaging the world with all these issues, I believe the EU has to be stronger. And then for government of my region to say, no, we're actually willing to leave the European Union and the Eurozone, which they perfectly well know that it's something that basically is not a good idea, and it's not going to happen. Now we do have the referendum scheduled for this year, November 9th, which ironically is the date of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let me just say that when I was here in Washington, 2009, and Spain won the, and since we have a lot of games, Champions League this tomorrow and today, when the Spanish soccer team, national team, won the World Cup, despite having many players from Barcelona, who play for Barcelona, and many Catalan players, I know a lot of people who wanted Spain to lose. And the Spanish soccer team cannot play in many parts of Spain, including Catalonia. They would be booed. Let me tell you what my position is. I feel that Catalonia has to have a better fit in Spain. That means what? What does that mean? For example, we should reform the Constitution. Now, nobody says the Constitution of Spain has been reformed. As you know, the Constitution of Spain does not allow for a vote on self-determination. My position and that of the business community, and I have personally told President Mas, and I had a one-hour conversation with him in June of 2013, those of us who are trying to say to him, do not listen to these radicals who are promising things that are not real, because right now, Catalonia cannot even sell its bonds in financial markets. We cannot. We have to be financed through the Spanish government. And then, of course, the standard answer from Catalan and the people independence is, that's Madrid's fault as well. Now, you know we had a real estate bubble in Spain, and the likes of which can only be compared to Ireland, Iceland, and some parts of the United States. Now, there was something called, when people were taking out loans to buy a secondary home, second house, they were also getting the so-called Cayenne credit. This was a Porsche Cayenne. It's an SUV, but it's a Porsche. It's not just any SUV. So people, of course, the banks were reckless. They lent money for a second home, and also they would give you the Cayenne credit. Now, Barcelona is the city in Europe with the most Porsche Cayenne SUVs. And somehow that is also Madrid's fault, which I still don't get it. So my point is, I'm listening. Those people now have difficulty making it to the end of the month. And I'm very sorry at a personal level. That Spain, if you put together Spain's public and private debt, is 166% of GDP. Now, Spain is making a comeback, and I'll be happy to take questions. We are leading the Eurozone in terms of growth in exports. Our growth in exports last year outpaced that of every single country in the Eurozone, and it was 5.2%. And Spain is making a comeback. And now that precisely Spain is making a comeback, and the Basque issue, at least we don't have any more violence. It is very sad for me that to have the situation where, at the end of the day, we're not going in the right. Not everybody's rowing in the same direction in Spain. So let me say that I favor reforming the Spanish Constitution, not now, because the priority right now in Spain is creating jobs and getting the economy going. But reforming the Spanish Constitution further down the line, making the Senate into more of like a chamber like the Bundesrat in Germany, where the regions really have more power. There are things that Madrid has made a mistake. For example, our high-speed rail network, which is the second longest in the world after China's, is radial. It took far too long to connect the high-speed rail network in Spain to the rest of Europe through Catalonia, and it's been designed radially. Also, EU has transport corridors. Spain has neglected the rail corridor, which is something that for the transportation of freight along the Mediterranean coast. So some of these investments in infrastructure from Madrid have been insufficient, and they have been designed badly in a radial way. Also, Madrid, there is a legitimate debate about Catalonia paying more to the rest of Spain in taxes than what it gets back in services. That's a legitimate debate to be had. And so that can be regulated. And also I'm also in favor of, therefore, Catalonia maybe having to pay less to the rest of Spain and getting more services back. So all those issues, I think, have to be on the table, but a divorce right now is not a good idea. And also, when you ask for a divorce, you have to ask for a divorce from a position of strength. And Catalonia right now does not have a position of strength. In fact, we cannot even fund ourselves by selling bonds in the private market. So I just want to tell you that we want you to come. We want you to visit Spain. Spain is the second country in the world in terms of tourism. We are ranked second, third, depending if you count how many people visit, or how many people, or what the money that the visitors spend, the tourists, how much money they spend. But we're number 2, number 3 after France and the United States. So I want to send a message of unity, but at the same time say that I'm very worried about what's going on in Catalonia, and I'm very worried that this is a topic that is being followed around the world. And I'll just end on a note. One of the beautiful things I love about Washington is that the Arlington Memorial Bridge. And there might be some dispute about this, but the Arlington Memorial Bridge in part was designed to simplify, and I'll end on this note, in part was designed to symbolize reunification, not reunification, but to symbolize reconciliation between the South and the North. And on one side, you've got the Lincoln Memorial. And on the other side, you've got the Robert E. Lee House, the top of Arlington, one of my favorite places in Washington. And you've also got Jefferson Davis Highway. Now, granted, the U.S. Civil War was in the 19th century, and our Civil War was in the 1930s. But when I think about a country that, with all its difficulties, the United States, with all its difficulties and everything that's going on, but at the end of the day, countries that can build a bridge after the Civil War the U.S. had, the bloodiest war in U.S. history, if my understanding is correct, to have that symbolism, say, we've got Robert E. Lee on one side of the bridge, Jefferson Davis, and Lincoln on the other. It is my dream that someday in Spain we would have something like that. And right now we're going in completely opposite directions. We're getting to a point where there's discussion of boycotting products. There were unfortunate comments made by previous governments that, for example, a previous Catalan government, the deputy president said that Madrid should not get the Olympic Games, and then people in Madrid started boycotting Catalan champagne, cava as it's called. So I'm very worried, and I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you for your time.
I would interpret Alex's opening remarks as, when in doubt, choose America. Well, I'm just about to ask Michael to give his comments, but before I do want to thank him for helping think through today's event and all he contributed, both intellectually as well as in terms of thinking of specific individuals to invite. So thank you, Michael, and now the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kent. It's true, actually, we did spend a couple of weeks trying to put this event together, and it has been, I suppose, a real challenge trying to persuade Kent to leave the Welsh side out of this particular event, largely because I do think Wales deserves its own event, followed by an event on Irish reunification. As part of my contribution to this panel, I wanted to, I suppose, deal with the relationship between an independent Scotland and its membership of international institutions and organisations. I think sometimes we tend to maybe take for granted that the map of Europe is somewhat set in stone. And I think in light of recent events in the Ukraine, that idea is a fallacy. And there is, a wide body of literature that talks about this third wave of decolonization. And we do tend to forget, or perhaps take for granted, or a lot of people think that history is yesterday, but Scotland was, of course, an independent country for a very long time, as was Wales, as was Ireland prior to the 12th century. But I think what I will argue here is that there is no automatic, in terms of international organizations, there doesn't seem to be any automatic succession to the membership of international organizations in international law. And there seems to be little doubt that if Scotland votes to leave Britain, the United Kingdom, it will, under international law, become a new state. And I think its challenge will be to gain international recognition, as Daniel said, and one of its first port of calls, I think, will be at the United Nations. And at the United Nations, there is a rich canon of literature on sub-territorial entities that have broke away from their own state. And I will touch upon some of these examples with a view to understanding how Scotland will be treated if it does decide to vote yes on the 18th September. I suppose an interesting starting point is India was an original member of the United Nations, and prior to the creation of Pakistan, the Legal Affairs Division at the United Nations argued that India would remain as a state with all treaty rights and obligations as a member of the UN. But the legal opinion then also said that Pakistan will be a new non-member state. In order for it to become a member of the United Nations, it would have to apply for admission pursuant of Article 4 of the Charter, and its application would be handled under the pertinent rules of procedures of the General Assembly and the Security Council. So back in the 1940s, the Polish delegation at the UN argued that, quote, "the state of affairs is not clear to us. we do not fully know whether Pakistan was born out of India or whether two new states have come into being. Of course, we accept India as a member and we welcome Pakistan, but this precedent cannot be cited in the future as justification in the event another state should split up into several states and all of them should ask for automatic admission, thereby depriving the Council of the privilege of making recommendations with regard to new members. That was about 1947. So the case of Pakistan raised important issues for the UN. The UN Secretariat had to contend with the following question. What are the legal rules to which, in the future, a state or states entering into international life through the division of a member state of the UN should be subject? And the decision it came to, the legal division of the UN, the decision it came to could be summed up as follows. That when a new state, I'm quoting, that when a new state is created, whatever may be the territory and the populations which it comprises, and whether or not they formed part of a member state of the UN, it cannot, under the system of the Charter, claim the status of a member of the United Nations unless it has been formally admitted as such in conformity with the provisions of the Charter, unquote. So an examination of the General Assembly's Sixth Legal Committee principles is revealing. The Sixth Committee of the UN is the primary forum for the consideration of legal questions in the General Assembly. So the practice at the UN since 1947 has largely remained the same, in accordance with the principles set down by the Sixth Committee. So when Singapore split from Malaysia in 1965, Malaysia remained a member of the UN, while Singapore had to apply for membership. When Bangladesh unilaterally seceded from Pakistan in 1971, the latter remained at the UN as a member, while Bangladesh had to seek UN membership. More recently then, with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russian Federation took over the Soviet Union's seat at the UN Security Council as a successor state, but the other former Soviet republics, with the exception of Ukraine and Belarus, who were original signatories to the UN, had to apply for membership. So, on the dissolution of Czechoslovakia then, at the end of 1992, both the Czech Republic and Slovakia applied anew for membership of the UN. And when Eritrea seceded from Ethiopia in 1993, it applied for UN membership, while Ethiopia remained a member. So the rules applicable to the financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, are a little different to how new states are treated at the United Nations, but in no way would lend any support, I think, to claims that independence would confer an automatic right to membership of the International Monetary Fund or of the World Bank. So again, in the case of India and Pakistan, India continued to be a member of the IMF, while Pakistan had to apply in accordance with the procedure set out in the IMF's Articles of Agreement. And the IMF took the same view on the separation of Malaysia and Singapore, and with Pakistan and Bangladesh. So the rules at the World Bank follow closely to those of the IMF. Now, in each of these international organizations, the rationale seems to be the same. Membership of an international organization confers, gives rise to rights and obligations of voting, with specific quotas of votes and obligations of contributing to the organization with fixed quotas of contributions. So either monetary contributions or the distribution or the redistribution of voting rights. And that applies to all international institutions, including the European Union, which again is one of these bizarrely almost undefinable organizations, but nevertheless we have fixed rules and quotas. So in the case of Scotland and Catalonia, or indeed Flanders or the rest, a new state would have to be, I think, formally admitted to membership of an international organization, because it is necessary that these matters are negotiated and agreed with the existing member states. I firmly believe that an independent Scotland would not automatically accede to the membership of any international organization of which Britain is already a member. The same applies to membership of the European Union. on Scotland gaining independence, it would no longer be part of a member state, and ergo no longer legally bound to the acquis communautaire, the corpus of EU legislation. None of this presents, of course, an insurmountable obstacle to, or for the potentially future Republic or Kingdom of Scotland. The Scottish case would not be unique. It would simply follow a path that many new states have taken. They are not reinventing the wheel. There is no reason to think that Scotland's application to any of these institutions or organisations would be rejected or vetoed by a petty London government. As the first country to leave the United Kingdom in 1922, Ireland proved that it could grow politically under the economic shadow of Britain and joined all major inter- and post-war international organisations post-independence. It was the Russians and not the British that vetoed Ireland's original application to join the United Nations, along with a number of other countries. So were the newly independent Scottish government to face obstacles in gaining UN membership, it could follow Kosovo's example. When Kosovo declared independence in 2008, it subsequently became a member of the IMF and the World Bank, but not of the UN. China and Russia do not recognize it as a state, although it is recognized by 107 members of the UN and 3 members of the Security Council. Rather, I think, than be cast adrift in the North Atlantic, Scotland's challenge in the period immediately after a yes vote will be, I think, to submit letters of application to the world's main international organizations and take its rightful place within the global family of nations.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. It's been a terrific discussion. Let's open it up for questions. And before I do that, I want to thank Christina. Christina, stand up and wave at everyone if you would. Christina has added photography to her many skills, and she did such a marvelous job of piecing everything together that we clearly are reminded of that old saying that strategy is for amateurs and logistics is for professionals. Mm-hmm. And Emily, is Emily here? Hi, Emily, stand up and wave, please. Emily did a wonderful job of putting together this morning's meeting, so we have 2 really talented global Europe people. Please, gentleman right there, and then we'll go over to the gentleman there.
A couple of quick questions for Daniel. One is you mentioned top 5.
Would you please introduce yourself and give your affiliation?
Policy planning. You mentioned top 5 concerns in a poll of Scottish voters. What exactly are those 5? Not the general concerns which James and you have so well expressed to us, but the specific concerns in a poll. And the other question for you is, what would the effect a possible yes vote in Scotland, would it have any impact, and if so, what kind of impact on the UK's deliberations about its membership in the EU and the vote that will come up in 2017? And the last question is for you. Really excellent research presentation, Michael. Thank you. All those precedents. For both of you, Daniel and you, would you say President Barroso's determination that he expressed about Scotland having great difficulty joining the EU, was it based on all these precedents, or was it based on the reality that one or more countries may not accept it, because in addition to Spain, there may be the other non-recognizers who don't recognize Kosovo as well? Thank you.
One by one. In terms of the top 5 concerns, you're testing my memory now of what they actually were. I don't think I'll be able to remember the 5 of them that came out on top. I just remember that the European Union wasn't in there. I remember that the top one in almost all of these. Oh, the poll I'm referring to was in February of this year. But these are done, periodically. And the top one was effectively state of the economy, what the state of the economy overall would be in independent Scotland. And the second, I remember the top 2, the second one was personal economic situation, what the personal effect would be on you and your family and, people close to you and so on. And I think that's, don't get me wrong, I just add a caveat to that. The Europe question, the pound question, obviously can't be totally detached from that. If you ask people to tick these boxes and separate the issues out, sure, we can rank them, but obviously in our minds we will link the European Union issue with what the state of the economy will be in independent Scotland. So they're not completely decoupled, but Europe as a specific issue is never comes out near the top. As I say, it was about 3%. The impact of a yes vote on the European Union's, on the UK's membership of the European Union, to be honest, I have to say I find this interaction between these two possible referendums incredibly complex. And I mean, in terms of trying to speculate on it, I think, you know, if we have a yes vote, then there's going to be presumably some sort of negotiation between Scotland, the UK, and the European Union, potentially going on in parallel to a UK negotiation or renegotiation about the terms of its membership. What the impact of that would be in terms of a UK vote, I guess there's, well, first of all, I guess there's the possible impact in terms of the negotiations in Brussels and how issues could be linked together. I don't see any obvious way that those issues get linked in Brussels, but I could be overlooking something. The impact in terms of then coming back to the UK and having a referendum on UK membership is potentially, I would suggest it would make it more likely, well, I'm not saying that the UK would vote to leave the EU, but I think absent Scotland, take away all those voters, I would suggest that the likelihood of an exit would go up. I couldn't put a figure on what that likelihood would be, but if you take away all of the Scottish voters into a separate country and ask England, Wales and Northern Ireland voters to vote in a referendum on the rest of the UK's membership of the EU, my simple guess would be that the odds would go up of an exit. Barroso, maybe we'll disagree on this, I'm not sure. One thing I've heard is that his assertion on the Andrew Marr show that it would be, you know, almost impossible, which was certainly going a lot further than his previous statements. One rumour I heard in Brussels is that was more to do with him wanting the NATO Secretary General job than it was to do with any particular stance on Scotland itself. My guess is that it would be, I think it comes more out of this issue of potential vetoes. Again, no country has yet gone on the record to say that they would veto, although most of the countries that have commented on it have said that it would have to be a formal accession process under Article 49. And I think he's probably looking at that situation and thinking, well, yeah, there could be a possible veto. Interestingly, if we go the route of renegotiating the treaties, which is what the Scottish Government's proposing, to me that's actually more likely to end up resulting in possible vetoes, because try unpicking the European Union treaties for one single issue, it just doesn't work. If you reopen the treaty just to deal with Scotland, everyone else will come forward with their issues, and before we know it, we'll have a full-blown treaty renegotiation on our hands. So my guess is that he's coming from the perspective of a possible veto and the difficulty, as always in Europe, of getting agreement amongst 28 states.
James, did you have an
Yeah,
added comment?
on the 5 issues, I think be very, very careful with the survey evidence on this. I agree with Dan's conclusion, but you know, it's not the best question to ask what are the most important issues. It doesn't elicit very intelligent answers. What we know from all the research that's been done is that economic well-being collectively and individually are way up top. But obviously, if people believe that the EU issue has an impact on that, then clearly it would do so. So even though, and I think Dan was saying that earlier, the EU may not formally be in the top 5 or at the top, top of the agenda, it could, as an issue, impact on that. So that's an important point. The other thing, in terms of if there's a yes vote, Scotland leaves, how would that impact on a potential 2017 EU referendum? I think that will depend in large measure on how our UK London reacts to Scottish independence. What will be the impact on the rest of the UK? How will it see itself? Will it be a massive shock to the system, comparable, perhaps more, than Suez was, which really shook the UK? Would that be the case? Here's this state that sees itself as a big state in international politics. We may think that's a myth, but whatever, that's how it sees itself. Will this really shock it? And how would that do? Will it react against this by saying, and will the public and will the politicians react, their politicians, they won't be mine by that stage, will they react by saying, oh, we are still a big place and we don't need to be part of the EU? Or will it kind of be a wake-up call for the UK? Richard Rose, one of my former colleagues at Strathclyde, quotes an unnamed Belgian Prime Minister who says there are only 2 types of states in Europe. There are those small states that know they're small, and there are other small states. I mean, the question is, for me, how will the UK react to a yes vote in terms of that question? Will it wake up to the realities? And if it does that, then I think our relationship with the EU, or their relationship, I'm going to have to get in the habit of saying theirs if Scotland votes yes, will be affected significantly, I suspect. But there's no certainty that would follow.
Yeah, I think, on the issue of Barroso, I was very surprised that he would be that forthright. I think it's probably a precedent for a Commission President to be that political on a domestic issue. But I can see why. The European Commission has two functions. One is to initiate legislation or policy, and the second is to act as guardian of the treaties. And if you look at they're also the chief negotiator in enlargement negotiations. And the last thing you would want is to create a precedent. Okay, so I am mindful of the fact that Barroso is outgoing Commission President. There was, of course, the rumour that he wanted NATO a job, and ergo, you're not going to antagonise London if you want Britain's vote for that. Although he didn't get it, of course, but nevertheless, I'm not surprised. But I do think that it will be a question of Article 49 for Scotland. But it will be, I would say, the easiest accession in the history of the enlargement process. Scotland has already applied the acquis. It has already applied the rules of the EU. So there's going to be no real transition period. It took Ireland, Denmark, and Britain 18 months to negotiate its enlargement negotiations from mid-1970 to the end of 1971. So 18 months is quite possible and feasible. But they're negotiations, and I think once if Scotland went independent, I think, notwithstanding the threat of a veto, that it would be a very straightforward and seamless enlargement process, at least between Scotland and the European Union, with Britain somewhere in between.
Alex had a brief comment.
Yeah, just very briefly, I want to say, and also because it's very gentlemanly, but maybe to ruffle some feathers, there hasn't been arguably a change in borders in Western Europe since World War II. And as we celebrate and mark anniversaries this year, 100 years ago, beginning of World War I and so forth, with the exception that I can think of, which was the referendum in the Saar to decide that the Saarland would be German, and maybe some minor adjustments between Italy and Austria, there has not been a change of borders in Western Europe since World War II. And there's a reason for that. Now, the examples with Estonia and so forth, the Baltic republics, these were communist structures, which were communist dictatorships, and they dissolved. And naturally, something had to come of that. Now, the point about Barroso, it's not just Barroso. I mean, every single EU official, President of the Council, Van Rompuy, even the President of the European Central Bank, because you have to remember, in our case of Catalonia, we're a member of the Eurozone, in addition to being a member of the European Union. Every single European Union official has gone on the record and said, if Scotland or at least in Catalonia's case, I'm very certain, if Catalonia illegally decides to hold a referendum, because of course a big difference between the Scottish situation and the Catalan one is, there is no negotiation between Madrid and Barcelona. And the Scottish referendum has been negotiated, but in Spain, the government, and I can tell you, I know the Prime Minister, I know his Chief of Staff, I deal with them, and they are not going to change their position. I, as a Catalan, am willing to think that maybe in a few years, when Spain's economy is doing better, and I don't know if Christina and Emily have done such a great job of some of the material on terms of on the business and financial and economic side, that you're able to access that information. If not, I think it could be uploaded later on the website, or personally, I'm happy to explain any questions. I here simply had some slides about Spain and the comeback it's making and the growth that Spain had between 1993 and 2008 when the crisis hit. But Spain is the 13th biggest economy in the world by volume of GDP, and the countries that are above us in terms of that, Spain being number 13, with the exception of Canada and Australia, they all have much bigger populations than Spain. So I'm very proud of the work that the Spanish government's doing. I'm very proud of how Spaniards are coping with the crisis, which is very difficult. And I just think it is very sad that right now, the same way that, let me put it this way, the same way that, I'm happy to be here in Washington, and I'm happy to discuss this very, very much on an intellectual basis. And if we want to discuss later the numbers in terms of what it would mean for Catalonia
Let me go to another question. I just want to be sure we get some more questions in.
Absolutely. I meant the economic effects. Yeah.
The gentleman there, and then we'll go to the gentleman here.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent for Europolitics. A couple of fairly short questions. In Scotland, has there been the debate about whether it will be a republic or a monarchy if it goes independent? And a historical question, I was curious when you said Ukraine and Belarus, always were UN member states or something? I mean, could you just explain how that happened? Because presumably they would have been in part of the Soviet Union.
Soviets insisted.
Well, briefly, yeah, and that they were original signatories back in 1945 of the United Nations. How they decided to be able to sign individually rather than as a part of something else is the ULTA. So there are some countries that were outside of the Soviet system that did actually sign individually, and when they became then independent, they didn't have to reapply for UN membership. They just reverted back to they were already a successor or an original signatory. So yeah, there are a number of examples of that.
Let's go to this gentleman here, and then there was a lady over there. Or did you have a second question?
The monarchy.
Oh yes, the monarchy.
On that, the official position of the Scottish Government is that Scotland would retain the monarchy. Having said that, there's ample evidence from polls that the Scots would be inclined to vote for a republic. Obviously, if Scotland votes yes, there would be, the Scottish Government proposes that there would be a constitutional convention at which no doubt the issue would arise, and it's quite conceivable at some stage in the future there would be a referendum on that, and I wouldn't want to put any money on it. But the First Minister is very much insistent that we'd stick with the monarchy, and it's part of this strategy of saying it's only the Union of Parliaments of 1707 that's under debate, not the Union of Crowns of 1603 that's under debate. But ultimately the issue of the Republic, I think, is bound to arise at some stage in the future, much more likely in independent Scotland than in the UK. So I wouldn't want to make a prediction other than that this issue will arise again in the future.
Thank you, Mark. Gentleman here, you can get the microphone, and then the lady over there.
Thank you. Gerald Chandler. I'd like to ask some questions about home rule in Scotland. If you can tell me what actually exists right now and what they want, whether they get independence or not. Do they want something separate from the NHS, the National Health Service, from the BBC, control of their schools, control of their police department, every sort of social issue like that? Could you go through them one by one?
Oh, it could take a long time, but essentially the Scottish Parliament currently has responsibility for a whole range of domestic issues, including health, policing, certainly there, education, local government, a whole range of matters. That said, we have to be very careful here because there are matters which will be affected by UK, not least of which, of course, is finance, because the Scottish Parliament is largely at the moment is entirely based on a budget handed to it by the UK Parliament. That's in the process of changing. The degree of financial autonomy is set to increase in the next couple of years, marginally, so it will be able to set, to some extent, its own taxes. But this is part of the big debate. I mean, leaving aside the issue of independence, the other political parties, the Labour Party, Conservative Party and Liberal Democrats, are in the process of drawing up proposals to extend what we call devolution home rule, and in particular to give the Parliament greater financial autonomy or financial responsibility. But it is extremely limited at the moment. It has not had borrowing powers, for example. That's about to change. It will have limited borrowing powers. There is a big issue here because, I mean, arguably Scotland has done reasonably well in terms of public finance through grants from London. Some would argue, and I would share this view, that Scotland has had more than its fair share in terms of population and certainly in terms of need. The grant is not based on need, and ultimately I think that is an issue that has to arise and will arise over the next few years if we vote yes or no. So there is a great degree of autonomy, but not in terms of its public finances. The National Health Service in Scotland is distinct. It is becoming more distinct since devolution in 1999. Scottish Parliament, both under Labour, Liberal Dems, and now under the SNP, has been diverging to some extent in public policy across those areas. Though, I should stress, some of this existed prior to devolution because Scotland was a distinct entity even before devolution. We had our own legal system even without having a legislature, which is kind of unusual. And that's where I guess in terms of, I suppose where I would slightly disagree with Alex is not so much the creation of a new boundary or a new border, it's about the new meaning of that border that's long existed. So home rule exists. I mean, I could certainly give you details, but it would take too long on what it involves. But it really is, this is a debate about the extension and how far that extension should go, with finance being the key.
The lady there and then the gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Chris Limborg with the British American Security Information Council. Thank you again for sharing your insights today. I heard a little bit about the EU membership in the case of a yes vote, and the UN was discussed as well. I'd like to hear a little bit about what may happen with NATO membership, and I'd also like to hear a little bit, if anyone could speak to the issue of the Trident nuclear weapon system, which is based in Scotland. Thank you.
Yeah, I can certainly talk about that. Trident was in my backyard until a year ago. I used to live in Helensburgh, which is about a mile and a half away from Faz Lane, where Trident is based, and it's certainly been a big issue locally in that area. It's an issue in this referendum, but not to the extent you might expect. On NATO membership, the SNP over a long number of years has been had an ambiguous view of NATO. In the past, in the 60s, it was in favour. In the 80s, it came out against NATO. But very recently, a couple of years ago, at its conference, it voted in favour of NATO membership. So the Scottish Government's proposals would involve Scotland remaining in NATO. Having said that, the SNP, as the leading party involved in the yes side, is overwhelmingly against nuclear weapons. Myself and some colleagues did a survey of the SNP's members in 2007-8, and there was overwhelming support for getting rid of nuclear weapons, but strong support for NATO. That was also reflected in interviews that I conducted with about 90 plus senior members of the SNP. So there's a kind of pro-NATO position, and which is reflected in the public, but an anti-nuclear weapons. Now, some would question whether that's these are compatible positions. I leave it to others who are defence specialists to comment on that.
The gentleman here.
Yes. Hi, Robert Moran, Brunswick Group. Jason Boxt and myself, we're both pollsters, but from different sides of the aisle, and appreciate your this wonderful discussion today and the sort of intellectual dialogue. Have a much more sort of granular question about the politics of this, because it's a referendum. So historically speaking, and this is a general assertion, not I mean, it might be wrong within the Scottish matrix, but historically speaking, the yes side of any ballot initiative has a harder hill to climb, because if people are undecided or they might generally be wanting to vote yes, but they might have some concerns, and then they vote no at the last minute, right? And so, at least historically, Democratic and Republican pollsters in the United States will say that the no side is always easier to run. You need to raise enough fear, uncertainty, and doubt to get people to just slow down and think about it and maybe look for a pragmatic fallback, like a Devo Max or whatever you want to call it. So I'm curious, to your thinking. I mean, I've seen the polling on and off around 40%. I don't, you don't see the internals, what those undecideds look like, if they're young people, old people, if they consider themselves Scottish or British, But I'm just curious where you think those undecideds will swing, number one. But then number two, if the no side has overplayed their hand a bit and created almost like a nationalistic backlash, because that's at least some of the reporting that I've read has suggested that it might actually be helping the SNP. So anyway, I'm just more about the dynamics of this.
All of that I agree with. I could happily talk to you at great length about each of these kind of points. I think the key thing is, if you listen to both sides, you would get the impression that the yes side is winning this debate. They are more optimistic, they're more positive, they're more upbeat. The no side is behaving and sounds as if it's losing, when clearly it doesn't appear to be so from the polls. But what both sides are doing, they have private information that the pollsters operating for the newspapers don't have. They've got more sophisticated knowledge of the electorate than the rest of us, frankly. As I understand it, both are not just asking the electorate, are you voting yes or no, but they're gathering information on the strength of feeling. And it would appear that though there are many people who are saying they're inclined to vote no, they are not doing so with great feeling. So if you like, on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being a no, there are an awful lot of people who are hanging around 5, 6, 7. And that is
turnout problems?
no is almost. I think no is likely to have greater problems, because there's a gap there. There's a kind of enthusiasm gap. I know that's a term you use here in the States, and I think the yes side has that on its side. In terms of the kind of demographics, men are more likely to vote yes than women. Also, there's kind of an age group difference here. Having said this, of course, I was going to say younger people are more likely to vote. Yes, but there is still a clear majority amongst younger people. Older people are more likely to vote no, and of course older people are more likely to turn out, so that may diminish that other gap I've just mentioned. So there are really interesting issues here. If turnout is important, then I think we could be in for a much more interesting contest. Yes can probably mobilise its support much more easily, get them out, they know where they are. They've got the people on the ground gathering all of this information, which the no side hasn't. That may change, and one of the big problems that the no side has is also one of its strengths. It's a cross-party campaign, Labour Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. However, many Labour activists are deeply unhappy at campaigning alongside Conservatives, understandably, and are reluctant to do so. Also, what we're seeing are a number of prominent, older Labour people coming out for a yes vote. And I think there is an element in the Labour Party that is extremely concerned because while they want to retain the union, they fear that retaining the union may mean continued Conservative rule and what may happen therefore to the welfare state. So there is a kind of, there's something going on there. That said, come closer to the referendum, I imagine that many Labour activists will be out and about. Having said that, again, come back to a point I made earlier, lots of caveats here, there aren't that many of them to start with. But, I mean, the referendum has been very interesting because both sides are claiming, and I think to some extent this must be true, that there are lots of new people getting involved in politics who've never been involved before.
16 and 17-year-olds.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about even, yes, indeed, that particularly, but also in terms of campaigning and such like. We are seeing the return of something that I thought had long since died, and that is the big public meetings, which the yes side are organising. No, we're not organising such meetings, but we're seeing, you know, meetings, public meetings, which I haven't seen since the 1970s, of, you know, hundreds plus people turning out in small towns. I mentioned Helensburgh, where I'm from. There was one there, small town, west of Scotland. You know, I think it was something like 200 people turned out to a public meeting, which, you know, in a normal general election, you know, you'd be lucky to get 20. So something interesting is going on.
We have actually long passed our witching hour, but maybe our panelists could stay behind for a moment and answer some individual questions. Would you please join me now in a round of applause for a very informative, very distinguished panel. Thank you all for coming. I suspect we will return to a number of European topics in the not-too-distant future.
Do drop me an email. I'm quite happy to give you
I thought this was extremely
no questions.